Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Kira Epstein, the program coordinator at the New School at Commonweal. And today's conversation is co-presented by two longtime Commonweal programs, the New School and the Collaborative for Health and Environment, or CHE. CHE's Executive Director, Kristin Schafer, and I are both really honored to welcome Kristina Marusic, Nsedu, Obot, Witherspoon, and Sandra Steingraber for a conversation about science, storytelling, and a new war on cancer. And we also thank our promotional partner, Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. I will turn this over to Kristin in a minute to introduce herself and her guests. But for those of you who haven't been with us before, the New School at Commonweal is a learning community, dialogue, and conversation that explores how to build more resilience and better stewardship for body, soul, community, and the earth. We produce our conversations and we make them available for thousands of listeners worldwide on YouTube, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We've been doing this since 2007, and in fact, we hosted Sandra for a conversation with our host and director, Michael Lerner, in 2007. So welcome back, Sandra. I think that's it. I'm going to turn it over now to Kristin, the director of Commonweal's Collaborative for Health and Environment. Over to you, Kristin.
Thanks so much, Kira. And thanks so much to everyone who's joining us today for our CHE Café. We're very excited for this conversation. Before we dive in, I'd like to say just a few words about the Collaborative for Health and Environment, or CHE, and also introduce myself briefly. Starting with CHE, the Collaborative was established just over 20 years ago with the goal of protecting people on the planet by amplifying the latest peer-reviewed science to support changes in policy and practice. We work with partners to offer 3 to 4 free webinars every month, bringing the voices of experts and affected communities to our national audience of researchers, policymakers, and advocates. We also host science-served discussion groups focused on particular environmental health topics, and we have a long history of organizing strategic convenings on key issues in the environmental health field. I stepped in as director of CHE about a year ago, bringing more than 3 decades of experience in the environmental health field, including a stint at EPA headquarters and 25 years in the world of science-based pesticide advocacy with the Pesticide Action Network, or PAN. Children's health has been a particular focus area for me over the years, and I worked with the scientists at PAN, particularly my former colleague, Dr. Emily Marquez, to produce 2 reports highlighting science linking pesticide exposure to children's health harms. And one of the strongest links we found was between prenatal pesticide exposure and increased risk of childhood cancers, which we'll hear a bit more about during today's conversation. And like many of us, I've lost friends and family members to cancer, so the issue of cancer prevention is a very personal one. So with that, let's dive in. We have 3 amazing speakers for today's conversation, as you know, focusing in on Kristina Marusic's recently released book, A New War on Cancer, The Unlikely Heroes Revolutionizing Prevention. In addition to Kristina herself, we have 2 environmental health leaders who I've had the opportunity to work with and deeply admire for many years, Dr. Sandra Steingraber and Nsedu Obot Witherspoon, both of whom I'll introduce properly a bit later on. Together, we'll consider Kristina's findings on current cancer trends and what's been missing in our 40-year war on cancer. We'll also explore the importance of storytelling in communicating complex and sometimes overwhelming scientific information. As Kira noted, we'll have time to bring some of your questions into the discussion as well, so please do drop them into the Q&A box at any time. So now I have the great pleasure of introducing Kristina Marusic. Kristina is an award-winning journalist of environmental health sciences who covers environmental health and justice at ehn.org and dailyclimate.org. She holds an MFA in nonfiction writing from the University of San Francisco. Her personal essays and reporting have been published by outlets including CNN, Slate, Vice, Women's Health, The Washington Post, MTV News, The Advocate, and Bustle, among others. Kristina lives in Pittsburgh with her partner of 10 years, Michael, and the cutest dog in the world, Mochi. Kristina will kick off our discussion by sharing some excerpts from her new book, which, by the way, is an amazing read that I highly recommend. So with that, Kristina, please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much, Kristin, for that lovely introduction and for hosting this today. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about my new book, but I'll start off by reading an excerpt from chapter 1, and then I'll also read an excerpt from chapter 3, which is the chapter that Nse is in. She's joining us today. I'll read for about 15 minutes, and then we'll continue the discussion. On an 80-degree day that followed a week of snow in late April 2021, I met Barry Breen at a coffee shop in Pittsburgh. She came directly from a hike at a nearby park. Her tank top and neon orange sports bra left the port in her chest exposed, a knotty lump above her left breast. Her frame was slight, and she wore no makeup, aside from delicately penciled-in eyebrows. We sat on the cafe's shaded patio, sipping cold drinks and marveling over how the sudden shift in weather had changed everyone's mood. People grinned and greeted strangers in a kind of collective exuberance about swapping out coats and boots for shorts and summer dresses overnight, and finally feeling the warmth of the sun for the first time after a long, pandemic-addled winter. A journalist colleague who was friends with Barry had connected us, knowing I was writing a book about environmental exposures and cancer. He thought I should hear her story. It was our first meeting, and Barry seemed a little nervous, which she compensated for by talking. I quickly learned that she grew up in Oil City, about 93 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, that Barry was her grandmother's maiden name, that she occasionally meets other women named Barry, B-A-R-I, but had met only one other Barry, B-E-R-R-Y, and that strangely they had both worked at the same grocery co-op nearby. She's an artist, a painter, and a musician, and works as a realtor to supplement her income. She has a half-sister who's 12 years older than she is and a brother who's 15 months older. She lives at the top of one of Pittsburgh's many hills with a roommate she described as a chill hippie, meditating, sober, likes to cook. We discovered that we're just 4 days apart in age, both born in March 1984, and she told me that this March, just before her 37th birthday, she'd had surgery to remove a cancerous tumor from her right breast. Then she'd lost 20 pounds and most of her hair while undergoing chemotherapy. Between sips of tea, she showed me the scar from her lumpectomy, a thin red line beneath her right armpit. She also showed me her new hair, taking off her hat and running her fingers over the short brown and gray fuzz that coated her scalp. In September 1993, more than 500 people gathered in downtown Boston for the city's third annual Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition March. After the walk, the event organizers asked anyone who'd experienced breast cancer to step inside a large outline of the state of Massachusetts they'd painted on the ground. Suddenly, the shape was crowded with bodies, bandanas or headscarves covering heads that were bald from chemotherapy. People cried and clung to their spouses or children. With all these pink ribbons everywhere, it's hard to believe now that not long ago, breast cancer was a hidden disease. Julia Brody, the executive director of Silent Spring Institute, a cancer prevention research nonprofit, told me in 2020. In the 1990s, women were just beginning to talk about their experiences publicly and connect with other women who'd had the disease. For many of the women at that rally, this was the first time they'd ever publicly acknowledged that they'd had breast cancer. It was incredibly emotional seeing that they weren't alone. At the time, the mortality rate from breast cancer was around 31 deaths per 100,000 people in the US, significantly higher than the current mortality rate of 20 per 100,000. The National Breast Cancer Coalition, including the Massachusetts chapter that sponsored the march, circulated a petition urging President Bill Clinton to develop a national strategy to address the disease. I take care of women with breast cancer every day, and I have seen too many patients die. Dr. Susan Love, one of the founders of the National Breast Cancer Coalition, told the Boston Globe reporter who covered the march in 1993. We have to be so obnoxious that they cure this disease just to get rid of us. Their plea was effective. Over the next decade, Congress allocated hundreds of millions of dollars for breast cancer research, and mortality rates dropped about 24%. But a quieter, parallel movement was also being launched at the same time, one aimed at stopping breast cancer before it started. The Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition had been active since 1991, but 1993 was the first year the state had ever published cancer rates by town. The report revealed that 9 towns on Cape Cod had significantly higher rates of breast cancer than the state average. The group called for a scientific investigation into why, but they were frustrated by the lack of existing laboratories capable of performing the investigation. So with a few $1 million from the Massachusetts legislature, they founded their own, bringing in scientists with diverse expertise. They named it Silent Spring Institute in honor of Rachel Carson, whose groundbreaking 1962 book, Silent Spring, brought national attention to the dangers posed by many pesticides, effectively launching the modern environmental movement. Carson died of breast cancer 2 years after the book came out. They were really a remarkable, visionary group of women, Julia said, referring to the activists who founded Silent Spring Institute. Now, they say they were naive at the time and didn't realize how hard that kind of investigation was going to be, but that's lucky. If they had, they never would have achieved so much. When the researchers first went to work trying to figure out why Cape Cod had elevated levels of breast cancer, they quickly discovered the difficulty of such an undertaking. Cancer is a complex disease with many causes, and while scientists generally know how cancer occurs at a cellular level, it's still virtually impossible to trace one person's cancer to one or more specific environmental exposures, let alone tracing exposures for numerous people, all with different health histories and habits. In 1994, only a limited number of studies had set out to do such a thing, so Silent Spring Institute researchers had to develop methodologies as they went. They enlisted help from researchers at Boston University, Tufts, Brown University, and Harvard, and conducted extensive analyses of the cancer data available at the time. They also developed new scientific methods to test air, dust, and urine for chemicals linked to breast cancer risk, then used those methods to test samples from 120 households on Cape Cod. They tested wastewater, groundwater, and drinking water for potentially cancer-causing compounds and conducted interviews with more than 2,000 Cape Cod women, both with and without histories of breast cancer, to collect decades' worth of data on risk factors, health histories, habits and activities, and places of residence. The project was so thorough and innovative, according to Brody, that it became a model for environmental health studies across the country. In the end, the researchers didn't find a smoking gun that explained the elevated cancer rates on Cape Cod, but they did find a surprising number and variety of potentially cancer-causing chemicals in most of the homes they looked at. While the study didn't exactly answer the riddle that Silent Spring Institute had set out to solve, the researchers quickly realized their data had much larger implications. Many of the chemicals they found in people's homes came from drinking water contamination and common household products, so it seemed likely that homes across the country were experiencing similar exposures. But for the most part, no one else was looking for them, at least in the United States. They had inadvertently discovered that Americans were being exposed to a host of potentially cancer-causing chemicals on a daily basis and were largely unaware. And now I'm going to read a bit from the beginning of the chapter about Nsedu, which is called Safer Little Ones Through Politics. Barry's hometown, Oil City, sits in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains where the Allegheny River and Oil Creek converge in Venango County, about 70 miles north of Pittsburgh. The area was once a Seneca Indian village named Onenge, meaning otter or mink, which white colonizers misheard as Venango. The chief of the Wolf clan of the Seneca Nation, Corn Planter, was given back a tract of land that's now part of Oil City as payment for helping with negotiations after the American Revolutionary War, but the county later attempted to retake the land from him for non-payment of taxes. Today, monuments to Corn Planter can be seen around town in Oil City, which was named for its role in the birth of the American oil industry. On August 27, 1859, one of the world's first oil wells was drilled in Titusville, about 16 miles north of Oil City. Oil City sits alongside a bend in the Allegheny River. The bend slows currents down, making it an ideal place for barges and boats to land, so it soon became a shipping hub for the burgeoning industry. In the town's heyday, riverboats transported millions of barrels of crude oil from Oil City to Pittsburgh. Pennzoil, Quaker State, and Wolf's Head Motor Companies were all founded in Oil City. The local population grew steadily until it peaked at around 22,000 in 1930. It then began a slow but steady decline as the oil industry fell into its ongoing cycle of booms and busts. By the 1990s, Pennzoil, Quaker State, and Wolf's Head had all relocated their headquarters elsewhere. Today, only around 9,000 people live in Oil City, including Barry's family. Nsedu Obot Witherspoon, or Nse for short, has spent 22 years working to help the keep harmful chemicals away from the people most vulnerable to them, children. She's the executive director of the Children's Environmental Health Network, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that was started in the 90s. She has also served as an advisor for the CDC, the EPA, and the National Institutes of Health. And NSE is a co-leader of the science and health arm of the Cancer-Free Economy Network. Relative to their size, children breathe more air, drink more water, and eat more food than adults, and their systems are still developing. This means that their bodies are less efficient at filtering out toxic chemicals than adult bodies are. It also means that delicate hormone-sensitive processes that are underway in kids can be interrupted by endocrine-disrupting chemicals, throwing a wrench in development and raising cancer risk. Emerging science also indicates that parents' exposure to chemicals before and during pregnancy can increase the risk of childhood cancer, and that kids' earliest exposures increase their likelihood of developing cancer later in life. Despite the science, most American schools and daycares are filled with harmful chemicals that can make their way into kids' bodies, from old materials in school buildings, pest control and cleaning products, flame retardants in carpeting and furniture, and PVC plastic used to make chairs, toys, and utensils. Nse has 4 children of her own. She gave me a virtual tour of the home she shares with her husband and kids in the DC area in 2021. With kids spanning the ages of 5 through 18, there was rarely a quiet moment. The kids teased each other, talked over one another, and guffawed over inside jokes. Over the years, they collected a bit of something for everyone. A ping pong table, a piano, video game consoles, Nerf guns, soccer balls, bins of dolls and blocks and puzzles and games, a punching bag, crystal and mineral collections, an air hockey table, a vast quantity of Pokemon cards, and boxes of hand-me-downs. They even have a swimming pool out back. Nse, who has golden brown skin and a wide, contagious smile, said she's always had an affinity for children, but having kids of her own amplified her protective instincts. Inevitably, you're mostly focusing on yourself until you start caring for other little souls, she said. Becoming a mom made me feel even more strongly how important it is that we protect these vulnerable little people who aren't yet able to stand up and protect themselves. Through the Children's Environmental Health Network, in 2004, Nse helped launch one of the first programs in the US aimed at reducing chemicals in early childcare facilities like daycares and preschools. A year later, the Oregon Environmental Health Council launched a similar state initiative, and in 2010, the groups merged the two and created the National Eco-Healthy Childcare Program. At the outset of these projects, Nse said, there were already several programs aimed at preventing harmful chemical exposures in K-12 schools, but there were none for children younger than elementary school age. Initially, some of the Children's Environmental Health Network's board members were skeptical about whether such a program could be effective given the scale of the problem. But they started small, launching pilot programs in a few states that offered free trainings for childcare providers on how to reduce chemical use and why it was important. Nse served as a trainer during the program's early days when demand quickly grew through word of mouth. It was really powerful to be in places from rural Georgia to California, watching people have the same kinds of reactions to this information we were providing, she said. There's a whole emotional cycle that happens when people find out they've been exposed to harmful chemicals their whole lives without their permission. First, there's anger, then guilt, then usually more anger. There's this false thinking that as Americans, we're more protected than we actually are. Today, Nse said, the program remains the only one in the country focused on preventing toxic exposures at early childcare facilities. It's available in most states and has trained more than 2,000 childcare professionals. It's also won several awards, including a 2019 Clean Air Excellence Award from the EPA. The program certifies facilities that comply with at least 30 of 35 free or low-cost practices. The checklist is detailed and comprehensive. It includes things like using non-toxic or less toxic pest control and cleaning methods, ensuring proper ventilation, barring idling in parking areas, testing drinking water and soil for lead, choosing the least toxic toys and art materials, and switching to safer materials for furniture, paint, and carpeting when renovating, among many others. Trainers in the program also review the health threats posed by chemical exposure, learning, developmental, and neurological disabilities, reproductive harm, asthma, and cancer. We're not at all into scare tactics, Nse said, but we believe people have the right to know these things so they can take steps to protect themselves and the children in their care. First, we empower them to do that. Then we try to help them take their angry energy and pivot it toward pushing for solutions on a large scale. I will stop there and pass the screen back to Kristin.
Kristina, thank you so much. Even though I've already had a chance to read your book, that gave me goosebumps. So I really appreciate you sharing today and hearing it in your own voice. So we'll now turn to Nsedu Witherspoon, a longtime colleague and friend who, as you heard, is one of the unlikely heroes profiled in Kristina's book. Nsedu is the executive director for the Children's Environmental Health Network, has for many years been a key spokesperson for children's vulnerabilities and the need for their protection. As you heard from Kristina, she holds leadership roles in many spaces, including the External Science Board for the environmental influences on child health outcomes at NIH, the Health Science Initiative of the Cancer-Free Economy Network, and recently for the National Environmental Health Partnership Council. Nsedu is also a member of the board for both PAN North America and the Environmental Integrity Project, serves on Maryland's Children's Environmental Health Advisory Council, and one of CHN's leadership awards, I love this, the Nsedu Obot Witherspoon, or now Youth Leadership Award, is named in her honor. She's also the recipient of many other awards, including the William R. Riley Award in Environmental Leadership from the Center for Environmental Policy, among others. So Nsedu, thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to now hand it over to you to share some thoughts on your cancer prevention work and also what it's like to have your story told in a book like Kristina's. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Kristin, Kristina. Again, congratulations. Sandra, it's always a pleasure. And CHE, thank you for using your fantastic platform for such an important conversation. And I know CHE is very interested in the actions that go beyond the conversation. Welcome to everyone. And I know we have a lot of our Cancer-Free Economy Network and Childhood Cancer Prevention Initiative colleagues and child health colleagues out here and overall public health leaders. So just appreciate you taking the time. As many of you know, I'm quite passionate about public health and learning from past harms so that we are all not a part of perpetuating those harms to current and future generations. So it is, of course, an honor, and I'm quite humbled to be highlighted in this way in Kristina's book. And I remember meeting Kristina a few years back in Pittsburgh when I know you were, if you will, activated is the word I'll use, by attending a very important cancer and environment symposium that many of our colleagues were heavily involved with in Pittsburgh that I know helped to really set your trajectory and focus. And we so appreciate you and your contributions to the field. In order to have this highlight and to be able to expand our reach, it's wonderful. And to be able to extend our education efforts, again, education for the point of getting people to act in whatever way that looks in the shape of your investment and the influence that one has. As we're all moving towards collective systemic change is what I would say, and then putting justice and health first, especially our most vulnerable. That is yet what I believe none of us have ever seen in our lifetime or in the history of this country. So as we've been discussing, the rates of many cancers, including childhood cancers, are on the rise and have been on the rise for the last 48 years. And 1 in 3 people in the US will be diagnosed with some form of cancer at some point in their lives. Also, the cumulative impacts of systemic racism and environmental injustice continue to take hold of marginalized communities that have never really had a chance to really get ahead of these cumulative impacts, such as Indigenous communities of color, and those living in low wealth communities. So unlike decades ago, we have a good amount of growing peer-reviewed science that Kristina's book highly emphasizes, and many folks on this call work in day out. And the science that shows us that primary prevention of cancer is not only possible, but is also necessary if we truly want to get ahead of and make the type of traction in the area of short and long-term illness like cancer and others that we claim that we want to do as a society. The reality is that the vast majority of funding, science protocols, and attention overall is focused on treating cancer versus preventing it. So we at the Children's Environmental Health Network and our colleagues and our partners are extremely focused on balancing out that attention to also include prevention. We're not taking away from treatment. We all need medical advancements in treatment. And as Kristin started earlier, we all are personally impacted in our own lives and those that we care about from cancer. So for the last 8 years or so, the Children's Environmental Health Network has served as a leadership in the Cancer-Free Economy Network. For those that don't know, we are a dynamic network of diverse teams, experts, advisors, stakeholders working in environmental, social justice, health, science, policy, legal, labor, business, and communication sectors together for the first time to prevent cancer and accelerate progress towards a healthy, regenerative, and equitable economy for all. Because at the end of the day, when we're honest with ourselves, we have to recognize that our dependence on these carcinogens and other chemicals of concern also very much feed our economy. So we also provide science to this network, right? We are kind of the foundation that tries to translate and bring forth the quickly evolving science that continues to provide the foundation of our work and advocacy. We, for example, created a joint statement on cancer prevention, the first of its kind, that brings together healthcare professional associations with cancer-serving organizations and other public health groups that never before together in one voice are articulating and prioritizing the need to prevent cancer. The overall narrative in the shift of the cancer discussion. We also work with cancer centers such as Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And just tomorrow, there will be a hybrid online and in-person session through Columbia University and another cancer center, Sandra and Edra Meyer Cancer Center, that will have a whole day of programming on cancer and environmental exposures. And Polly Hoppin, who's on, has been a big part of that. Julia Brody with Silent Spring Institute and many of our colleagues at the Cancer-Free Economy Network. And we're also working on state cancer plans. Majority of states in the country have a state cancer plan. Vast majority of them do not even acknowledge environmental contributions. So that also needs to change. We need to make sure that our plans for trying to address these very important, serious, short and long-term concerns that impacts the entire family and community, I would say, really need to acknowledge what the science is acknowledging and lived experience. We are also leaders in the Childhood Cancer Prevention Initiative, which includes leaders from the Cancer-Free Economy Network and childhood cancer prevention organizations, healthcare associations, and sustainable business leaders. So again, the rate of childhood cancer diagnosis has been increasing, has increased 34% since 1975, the year I was born, and has been steadily increasing every year. We know that we released the first report of its kind on childhood cancer and cross strategies for prevention a few years back, which identifies some of the major routes, high level of exposures for children. That includes certain forms of pesticides, that includes air pollution from vehicles in particular, and paints and solvents as high level targets, if you will, that we can and need to be focusing on as a community to get ahead of these trends. We also are in discussions with President Biden's Cancer Moonshot team at the White House, trying to also engage around their definition of prevention and making sure that all of our federal agencies that are trying to implement this Cancer Moonshot plan also gain the benefit of our collective understanding in science, but also that we can help them in their work towards prevention that they're aiming as far as the goals that they're trying to fulfill. We also have a pesticides project that launched, and we're working to implement actions around an agenda to reduce exposure to pesticides where children spend the majority of their time. And then finally, also, some of us have been working with the pediatric environmental health specialty units. There's one in every region that have been working to train and educate cancer treatment specialists across the country, which is also a great way to build on change agents. So I would just say in closing, I'm quite honored and humbled to be highlighted in Kristina's book, and we should not have to work so hard collectively in the year 2023 to remind policy leaders, funders, and those who establish public health standards and research that children and their vulnerabilities and all vulnerable populations must be considered in all that we do, if not at least the decision-making, and that our children's voices are needed more than ever. And we cannot claim ignorance here. The science is available and we need to move on it. So thank you. And I'm glad to be part of this conversation.
And so thank you so much. I so appreciate all of your work. And I was so excited to see you highlighted in Kristina's book as the public health hero you are. Now I'd like to bring in a longtime leader in the environmental health movement who I've been inspired by for many years, Dr. Sandra Steingraber. Sandra is a senior scientist with the Science and Environmental Health Network, was a distinguished scholar in residence at Ithaca College in New York from 2003 to 2021. She's the author of a trilogy of award-winning books on environmental health, the first of which, Living Downstream, an ecologist's personal investigation of cancer and the environment, was adapted into a documentary film in 2010. As an aside, Pan co-hosted a screening when I was there of this film in San Francisco with the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. Sandra also wrote Having Faith, an ecologist's journey to motherhood, and Raising Elijah, Protecting Our Children in the Age of Environmental Crisis. Sandra has received numerous honors for her work as a researcher and science writer, including the Rachel Carson Leadership Award and others. In 2011, she donated the funds from her Heinz Prize Award to the anti-fracking movement and became co-founder of New Yorkers Against Fracking, a statewide coalition of hundreds of grassroots organizations that helped win a ban on fracking in New York in 2015. The 2018 documentary film Unfractured tells the story of New York State's fracking ban. So Sandra, turning it over to you for your reflections, both on Kristina's book and on the role of storytelling in science communications. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And Kristina, brava, standing ovation, blowing kisses and throwing roses at you. And what an honor to be able to say a few things after Nse, who's certainly a personal hero of mine and acts so many of the ideas in Kristina's book. I also want to give a big hello to my colleagues in the Science and Environmental Health Network who are here in the audience too. At Science and Environmental Health Network, we try to provide good science and legal resources to frontline communities like those profiled in the book. And so I feel like I've finally at this age found a really good home to do my own work as a environmental health researcher and an author. So I'm very glad to be embedded within the Science and Environmental Health Network. And if you don't know about our work, please take a look. I'm also speaking to you today from Ridgecrest, California, near Death Valley in Kern County, California, which has some of the highest fracking here in the nation, and has kinds of water contamination problems and cancer clusters and so forth, but I'm actually not here as a researcher. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about where I am, and hopefully it will serve as a segue to the conversation today. And the first reason I need to mention it is because I'm at an Airbnb that turns out not to have a very good Wi-Fi connection. So if I should get disconnected, I'm going to try to quickly use my phone to reconnect with you, but so far, so good. The reason I'm here is not having anything to do with fracking or the water contamination that is alleged to exist in so many communities that I'm now living within temporarily, but rather I'm here to visit a relative who has recently died. And in fact, right before I got on the call, I was just helping to write her obituary. I, as you might know, am an adoptee. And so part of my story that I have written about is the way that cancer has run in my adopted family, including I was diagnosed very early on with bladder cancer, and I have an aunt who had the same kind of cancer I had. My adoptive mother and I were actually in cancer treatment at the same time. She was diagnosed with breast cancer at an early age. And so part of my story, those of you who know it, is to make clear that just because cancer runs in families, it doesn't necessarily run in genes. And as an adoptee who was raised in a family where I don't share chromosomes, I feel kind of like a living example of the importance of environmental exposures. And part of the work that I've done is in my own writings to return back to my hometown, become a kind of environmental detective there, and uncover that I was just one data point in a whole cluster of cancers, because very possibly because of contaminated drinking water, and also because of some of the worst air quality in central Illinois. But I'm here to bury a relative who's my birth relative, who it took me 40 years to find. As an adoptee, you might know that there's still secrecy surrounding adoption, preventing us adoptees from knowing who our biological ancestors are. And my anger over that secrecy was actually determinative in my anger over secrecy around right to know laws and around toxic exposures. So I'm kind of self-righteously angry about secrets of all kinds that affect and harm people who need to know, have an actionable need to know about something. I came here to find a great aunt of mine who is one of the few people who have welcomed me into the family I was born into by blood. She is an ex-nun. She was brought as a child from rural Oklahoma out to the Central Valley of California during the Dust Bowl. She's led an extraordinary life. And I finally, through DNA testing and through search angels and all kinds of runarounds of the secrecy that surrounds adoption, I finally found her. And she invited me to her home out here in Ridgecrest, California, and died a week later. And what brought her to the hospital the second day I was here was a terrible urinary tract infection. And as a bladder cancer patient, I have had many, many of these and know how awful they are. So her caregiver and I had to call an ambulance, took her in. She had a massive infection. And then the resulting workup showed that she actually had an ovarian tumor that was pressing on her kidney and her ureter. And antibiotics through IV helped turn that around. But while she was in the hospital, she suffered a massive stroke. So I just got to meet her and spend a couple of days with her. I got to hear some family stories. And then I got to hold her hand while she died just a few days ago. And you have to understand, having never met a biological relation other than my own two children, holding the hand of an actual ancestor of mine and helping her through that passage was profound. And I turned out to be the only member of the family who was with her. And yet I hardly knew her as family. So it's an emotional time for me, but it's important that I be here because this is exactly, Kristina's book exactly hits on my situation in a way, and the situation of so many of us, because even though my aunt may also have had cancer, my birth aunt, as well as people in my adoptive family, the point is that we can do nothing about our ancestry and nothing about the DNA we've inherited, whether or not we've inherited DNA that make us more vulnerable to cancer formation or not. But we can do everything about carcinogens in our environment. And so Kristina is exactly right that removing carcinogens from our economy is the rational place to begin any kind of program of cancer prevention. And that doesn't mean that knowing our heredity is not important. But what I have learned as a cancer patient myself is that the reason we need to know our inheritance is not so much to know why we have cancer, but it's to make the medical system move for us. If I didn't know that one of my biological relatives had an early onset colon cancer, I would not have been able to compel the insurance company to pay for my colonoscopy at 35, which showed I also had a colon lesion that needed to be removed that almost certainly could have killed me at a young age. But it just so happened I had, at that time, one other tiny piece of information about my biological family, which was that my maternal grandmother, my aunt's sister, the one who just died, she had had colon cancer when she was young. That was a little detail I knew, and it may have saved my life. Not because inheritance causes colon cancer, but because we overdetermine the role of heredity in allowing cancer patients to have access to early detection and in paying for and helping us pay for that. So now I know my great aunt had ovarian cancer. I actually had my ovaries out at a young age and threw myself into surgical menopause and had to pay for that myself because I didn't have a family history to offer at that point, right? So I can't emphasize enough that no one asks you as a cancer patient, did you grow up near a toxic waste site, which also is a risk factor for both bladder and colon cancer, and is just as determinative as some kind of aunt, sister, grandmother, mother who may have had that disease. So that is why the work that Kristina is doing as an author and a reporter, and the work that Nse is doing as an activist really matters and is absolutely life-saving, and is also just backed by science. The science is very clear that a very tiny percent of cancers are actually caused by straight up inheritance of a genetic factor, and in 90% of the cases, environmental exposures, and also things like our diet, which is not, of course, also comes to us as part of the environment, is really what really matters. So thanks to Nse and to Kristina for shining this light on exactly where it should be shown. Now, I myself have written about these things as an author, so I want to pivot a little bit now and close by sort of talking about how we tell narratives about this. Talking about cancer is scary. It's kind of taboo still. Everyone likes to walk around kind of whistling past the graveyard and pretending that they won't be diagnosed. And so reading a story where you feel empathy towards somebody who's facing a catastrophic diagnosis and lives in a toxic place is a hard kind of exercise. And a lot of people avoid doing that. And so I know that I have to think strategically as a writer about what sort of writing tactics and strategies that we know as kind of creative writers or reporters will keep my readers turning pages and not turn away from the story, right? And so for me, I kind of combine autobiography and sort of personal witness and sort of the feeling of testifying to what I've seen in my hometown and in my adoptive family, and I combine that with what I know as a biologist and kind of braid together a couple of narratives. And I believe that there's power in that. I believe in the work that I do. But I just want to say that Kristina's work has another kind of power for me, because it's not just one person's voice. She has brought together a constellation of voices, Nse being one, all of whom are heroic in their own way and are engaged in the hard work of activism and policy out of the trauma of cancer diagnoses of them or their children or the people in their family and community. And so the power of that kind of narrative is that you aren't just limited to, like if you read my book, you're just limited to what Steingraber has to, how she experienced the world in one place. But in Kristina's book, you see not just one place, right? Not just one person. So I feel like there's three things going on here. One, by centering the human lives behind the data, she rehumanizes the experience of being a cancer patient. So we see the person who's got cancer, the person who's taking care of people who have cancer, we see the world through their eyes. So there's a rehumanization that takes place. But more than that, and I think you heard that from her, the excerpt she read, you also see the environment in which these people live. So if there's environmental history, we see the sort of ecological roots, not just in what's happening now, but what might have happened, in Oil City decades ago that have created a situation for people now. And so in that kind of making that visual for us, we see the human rights crisis that is cancer, because we see that environmental decisions and decisions around toxic chemicals that were made 80 years before people were born are now harming these folks. And so somebody profited from that, but somebody else is paying the price with their lives. And so you see the kind of so you see the person as a real human being. You see the environment that they live in and how it shaped the health problems that they have. But then the third thing that makes this book so remarkable to me is that you see how those individuals took the trauma of their own experience and their love for the community that they live in and became activists and did the hard work of engaging in policy and straight up activism and not just one person, but many people, so that as you read the chapters, you could imagine yourself sort of like some people I felt more like me than other people in the chapter, right? So you have like a menu of people that you could choose to be your role model. I guess that's what I want to say. And for me, it's those three things: making those people human and having agency, showing that the whole community in which they live and the environmental history that impinged upon it, and then revealing how those individuals did the heroic work of activism and policy. And that, to me, is just a remarkable thing. And so, again, I want to I'll just say congratulations. What a remarkable triumph, and how great it is to then have with us one of the people in one of the chapters, Nse, who's can speak to us, kind of bring the whole thing to life. So lastly, Dick Clapp is on this call, and I just want to let everyone know that one of the great heroes of environmental epidemiology, who helped me actually analyze the data for my own book, and who served as a cancer registrar in the state of Massachusetts before his retirement, along with had a whole career in going into communities as a scientist and revealing the connections between environmental exposures and health. He's kind of the grandfather of all of this. And I see that he's in Maine, so hope he's in a beautiful place listening in. And what an honor to have Dr. Clapp on the call. Okay, back over to you, Kristin.
Sandra, thank you so much. And thank you for bringing the personal moment that you're in into this discussion and sharing with us the connections to the work that we're doing here and the stories that are being shared. So thank you. Okay, I'd like to move us into conversation. And before we dive in, I see there are a handful of great questions in the Q&A, but I have a couple of questions to get us started with. I actually want to build on, Sandra, what you were diving into of kind of the difference of writing as an individual and writing as a journalist. And I would add to that list sort of writing and storytelling as an advocate, right? And I'm wondering if each of you can reflect a little bit on what the hurdles are for each of those kinds of writings, what the power is in communicating this kind of complex and often overwhelming information in ways that are going to reach people and motivate them. Kristina, maybe you can start us off.
So I think in my work as a journalist, I think a big part of the job is, I think of it as translating. And certainly that's true in science communication. I kind of think of science communication as my process is talking to people who have a lot of expertise in this subject matter, like Sandra, trying my best, asking every stupid question I can think of to make sure I kind of fundamentally understand what's going on. And then trying to rephrase that in language that's accessible to non-scientists without losing important nuances. And I think I rely a lot on the goodwill and patience of scientists who are trying to explain things to me in that context. I often send them what I've written to confirm that I didn't lose anything in translation. When I'm talking to, kind of telling other people's stories, that's a different kind of translation. And I think comes with a different sense of responsibility to really make sure that I get it right and honor their experiences. I also think, I feel like a duty to kind of protect my sources. It's really different. Telling your own story and offering your own vulnerability is really challenging and brave and comes with its own, unique hurdles to overcome. And then when you're telling other people's stories, I really want to make sure they know what they're getting into, right? That they are aware of what might happen if their story is out in the world and how it's going to feel to hear from other people. Even, I read a few sections about Barry. She came to my book launch here in Pittsburgh, and I had breakfast with her in advance to say, hey, if you're in the room, how do you feel about me reading a part of the book that you're in? And she was like, oh, great, no big deal, totally fine. And I said, okay, just so you know, one thing that might happen is that a bunch of people might come up to you afterwards and want to tell you about their cancer experience or their mom's cancer experience. And that can be really emotionally overwhelming. That can be a lot if you're not in the right headspace for it. And she was like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Maybe actually, could that be like a game day decision for me? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to default to not doing that. And then the other question was, do you want me to say that you're in the room? This is Barry. She's right here. Do you want to wave? And after we really talked it through and what might happen as a result, she was like, actually, maybe I'll just kind of stay quiet. So I think one of the hurdles is, just making sure that I account for that I account for the fact that I'm telling other people's stories, but then it's their vulnerabilities that are going to be out in the world.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and appreciated, right? To be so thoughtful about how folks are going to feel that. And say, maybe we could turn to you as one of the folks who was profiled and see if you have any thoughts along those lines about how it felt to kind of sort of see your personal story reflected, and whether you've had conversations and follow up, and then also relatedly, like your communication strategy as an advocate, which is also sort of telling the stories in ways that are going to motivate people to act. Any thoughts to share on that?
Yeah, thank you. We need a lot more of this experience taking hold, for sure. I think the days of lecturing, as a broad sense in our community, come on, the COVID pandemic, the height of the COVID pandemic sadly showed us many things, and it showed us we cannot take one or two approaches to our communication and expect that we're going to have a massive experience that then gets us where, in theory, as a collective, we are hoping to get. This is not, this is nothing too new, but just a reminder that we have to meet people where they are. We have to know our audience, right? We have to do a bit, and that also engages trust building, that engages if I might not be the best messenger, right? But whom in the community may be the best messenger, especially when we're talking about speed of time and urgency. The train derailment, we have train derailments all the time. The train derailment that, got a lot of press in the recent months, that was such a quick urgency for communication, effective communication. People needed to know where to go, what the impacts were going to be, when they should move back. We didn't have the luxury collectively in public health of time. So it's like, again, having the reliable messengers who have the appropriate message, in theory, that then can help people get to the point of making their decisions, but hopefully with a more informed state of mind. And I would say the storytelling aspect, again, this is not new. A lot of this comes from our indigenous history in this country and beyond. There are a lot of cultures that have used storytelling forever. And the huge value of that is that, again, many folks that tend to not see each other on the same side politically, or maybe think that there isn't not a whole lot in common between the zip codes that one was brought up or spends time in, or the circles by which we spend time in. The storytelling aspect allows that human to human connection. I may not completely understand your story, but odds are there's something in your story that I can relate to. Mm-hmm. And there's a human psychology of that is well evidence and based, and it even gets into some racial healing work that I've done. When you can connect with people on a human to human level, again, we don't have to be best friends. That's not what we're aiming to do here, but we are aiming as humans that need to live in this space together to try to at least hear each other out, come to some form of solution that we can all benefit. We have yet to see that at a large scale, but it is exciting for me to see, encouraging to see more and more, especially community-oriented programs, really prioritizing a storytelling approach. And it takes time. Again, you can't rush that, and to build that into grants and to make sure that there is adequate time for communities to build trust, understand whom they're working with, whom their information is coming from, to better understand the science that I also perpetuate often, and not assuming that just because I translate it into a third grade reading level, that someone is still going to understand what that means for their daily life to then make proactive action. Mm-hmm. And then also understanding the real emotions here, the true valid emotions that I think I was speaking to in the piece that Kristina mentioned. I'm angry. People are angry, right? When they come to this point of understanding this information, much more than not, I keep running into people who want to then do something about it, even within the amount of time that they may have to do it. But there's also this digestion of, what do you mean when I go out and bring food into my home, it's contaminated? What do you mean when I put on lotions on my young child that probably has had stuff that I did not want them to have? What do you mean when I'm warming up their baby bottle, unless it's a certain type of, in my aspect, very expensive baby bottle, there's no risk there to that child being exposed to certain forms of plasticizers and other things. So, we have to allow this evolution to happen. It's not on my timeline. It's on the timeline of community members that we are, in essence, trying to serve while we are all trying to learn here. I certainly don't have it all together. but how can I lift up my story, as Kristina has so, I think, delicately done in this book, to hopefully help others take a moment to understand we're all in this. I'm a mom too. I don't have all the answers. I can't buy my way out of this. None of us can, but we have to do better by taking care of each other. That's where I think. And I think that human connection is a different type of learned experience than any textbook at times and any article or peer-reviewed journal can provide.
Great, very powerful thoughts. Thank you for sharing. And say, I want to note that as we're reaching the top of the hour, that we are scheduled to go to about quarter after, so we do have time for a bit more discussion. And Sandra, I wanted to come back to you. You mentioned in your remarks the kind of delicate interweaving of the individual, your perspective as an individual and your perspective as a scientist, and how that's really been kind of how you've moved forward with the books that you've shared with the world. I wonder if you want to add anything about that, the challenges of that, or what you think is powerful about that strategy.
Well, I guess that I don't have to worry about asking anyone else if they're ready for the fallout that's going to happen. I just have to check in with myself and do my own self-discernment, because it is absolutely the truth that my book signing lines are filled with people who have to tell me their own cancer stories. And I have a box of things, of gifts that people have given me, including, this is the program from my sister's funeral where she wanted an excerpt of one of your books read aloud. Here's the coat that my sister went bird watching before she died of ovarian cancer. She wanted you to have this. So, I just have to check in with myself about this. But on the other hand, because my situation is actually slightly unusual, I think, in that I grew up in a town that was really considered a kind of sacrifice place for the industry. There are 30 different industries, including 2 coal-burning power plants. And yet it's an all-white community, essentially. It's a white working-class community that, for very particular historical reasons, starting with the Supreme Court decision in 1900 about redirecting the flow of a river that brought all kinds of sewage and slaughterhouse waste that killed off the fishing industry and the pearl button industry, because we had clams, that opened the door. One dirty industry attracts another, and we ended up it's coal country Illinois. We ended up being the place where the big coal plant for that powered Chicago is located. So we breathed in all the air. There are all kinds of solvents in the drinking water, but as an all-white community, that's actually not a typical story. And so the environmental justice piece of it really disproportionately affects our Black and brown brothers and sisters more than people like me. And so that's a story, and that's a message I can't really carry, right? And that's where I see the power of journalism, which allows a kind of reportage that can not only look at the trends in the cancer, in the spatial and temporal trends in the cancer data, but can look at who the communities are who are mostly disproportionately affected, and then uplift them and provide agency and shine that kind of spotlight. So that's work that I don't engage in myself as a biologist and a kind of more lyrical writer that comes out of the kind of tradition of Rachel Carson, but that I see happening in certain kinds of journalism being practiced by Kristina, but also as a biologist who is one of the editors and authors of the Fracking Science Compendium, which some of you may know is a big project of the Concerned Health Professionals of New York, now in its 9th edition. So we're working on the 9th edition. And that is now coming out of Science and Environmental Health Network, for whom we are now a project and a partner of. What we've noticed, those of us who are the sort of scientists, especially Carmi Orenstein and myself, who are the 2 kind of principals of that project, that there are things that that investigative journalists have uncovered that we have profiled, because science can't and doesn't go to those places. And I think science sometimes has a hand tied behind its back because of databases that are not available in the public. And yet investigative reporters have things like Freedom of Information Act requests that they can ferret out stuff that scientists don't actually have available to them. And so there's a power in investigative reporting that sometimes the scientists who want to profess objectivity confuse, I think, scientific objectivity with political neutrality. And so scientists will almost self-censor and not even be willing to represent their own data, for example, and to testify before state legislatures or other federal agencies. It's, again, Dr. Dick Clapp is a rare exception to that. And I've learned from him how to speak data to power. But there's a way in which investigative reporting goes to those places and doesn't confuse objectivity with political neutrality the way I feel like some of my scientist friends do. Also, when you publish in the peer-reviewed medical literature, honestly, maybe 6 people read your whole thing. When you publish as a journalist, you get many more readers. You have this big public platform, and I say that even knowing that journalism and newspapers especially are suffering right now, but there's still a kind of power that the platform has that I just am in awe of. And I should say, I'll close by saying my own son, I'm very proud of. He just graduated from college and as a journalism major, and now is going to start a 2-year stint as an investigative reporter focused on the climate crisis as part of Report for America, which places young journalists in underserved communities. So he's moving to rural South Carolina, where there's no daily newspaper, to try to provide coverage to local communities. And so I'm really happy to see that he has looked at my own work as growing up with it as a child, and sees that, you know, journalism actually has a kind of power that mom's work doesn't, and that I can do that work. So when I see Kristina kind of as somebody operating in that, you know, who has that kind of power behind her as a reporter, it's something that I have just absolute respect for. There's just different narrative strategies and a different way, a different tradition of looking at what's objective that scientists and writers of memoir and autobiography, we just don't have that kind of power. So I'm in awe of it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sandra, and congratulations on Elijah moving into that work. All right, we're going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A and start with a question that sort of builds on what we've been talking about in terms of the challenging message that and the messaging and how to move that forward. So Jean-Marie asks, when writing about environmental causes of cancer, how do you balance the grim and the hopeful? And how do you pitch projects on subjects that many would rather remain blissfully unaware about? So maybe, Nse, I'll start with you if you have any thoughts on that question.
It's a good point. Ignorance is bliss, right? I mean, again, these are very emotionally charged issues. I mean, and I would even go broader. You know, no one that I've ever run into admits in public that they want to see a child harmed or anyone harmed or a future pregnant mother, you know, and yet our actions do not support ensuring that we reduce those risks. And it doesn't feel good, right, to see a child or to learn about a child or anyone who we know had nothing to do with the state of where we are, the state of wondering if we can breathe generally decent air today on the East Coast or the West Coast, or our water supply, our food supply, all of it. For me, it's not backing down. I mean, maybe it's also I've been at this a while too, right? A couple decades, and I feel I don't have too much more to lose at this point. You know, there are people, to Kristina's point, that will interview and then miscategorize. And you can tell I try to, I'm very careful taking interviews when I try to do as much interviewing of the reporter as much as they are of me. There have been times very recently, there was a New York Times article on childcare in Head Start programs, and I got a lot of calls about it, right, when it finally printed. And as I suspected, there was definitely an agenda. In my humble opinion, there was an agenda because the way that the question was posed already had a very biased view of what was not happening. And I felt it was a very unfair picture for an industry, even prior to the COVID pandemic, that has been in need of help and attention for a very long time. And I don't think it helps any of us to villainize a part of our industry that is trying to support children in healthy environments rather than trying to do what we can to bring them the information that we have. What we've learned from our eco-healthy childcare program is that 9 times out of 10, most providers have never even had the basic information that you all have heard today. That goes even beyond carcinogens, it goes to chemical exposures. So it should not be surprising, sadly, when there are certain things found that have not been part of protocol, standard setting, policy. It doesn't mean it goes unnoticed, of course, but I don't think blasting an entire industry in the New York Times is going to get us where we need to go, in my humble opinion. And then I've had other interviews that have been a spark, and I hope Kristina's book is one of those examples that has then led to agencies and discussions that then led to actual introduction of bills that have started to make a difference. California and other states have been a great example, right? These things didn't happen overnight. A lot of advocacy work, but a lot of sometimes the attention in our media and some of the reporters out there also combined with advocacy and science has been a wonderful storm that has allowed some proactive protective actions to happen, while many of us at the national level are working on the policy change so that people shouldn't have to worry about the type of things they're bringing into their homes, that all of it would be under the ceiling of, basic health and wellness. So sorry, I might have gone a bit out on tangent there, but that's where I would start with that.
That's all good. And I do want to we want to sort of shift to some questions about sort of actions and the focus of like how we move forward. But I did want to give you, Kristina, and you, Sandra, an opportunity to sort of comment briefly on that grim versus hope question. Like, how do you approach telling those stories in ways that inspire rather than, leave people feeling helpless? Maybe Kristina, start first.
Sure. That's a big part of why my book is so focused on solutions. So there's a lot of information in the book that's really upsetting to learn, as Nse talked about. I think I had like some friends who were early readers of the book, and in that section, I read about Nse where she's describing the kind of emotional cycle of like shock and then grief and then anger. Some of my readers were like, that's what I'm experiencing reading this book too. And so I knew that was going to be part of the experience for readers who, maybe have never had this information presented to them. And I really wanted the book to focus on the people who are trying to solve these problems. So, I read some of Barry's story, and her story is about having cancer and going through treatment and being concerned about her environmental exposures. But everyone else profiled in the book is working toward solutions to this problem. And so learning those stories for me, and not just the stories about like the work that Nse is doing, but the like childhood and family history that motivate her in this work and keep her coming back and able to keep doing this really, kind of emotionally challenging work every day, made me feel really hopeful and inspired as I was working on these stories as a reporter. And so my hope is that the book will do that for people too, that it kind of does give some space to, explaining the scale and the breadth of the problem, but that really leaves people feeling inspired by the work that lots of really brilliant, capable people are already doing on this front, and then empowered to help out and pitch in and join the movement.
Thank you. Sandra, thoughts on grim versus hope? I
think that what we've just heard is exactly right, that you can't downplay the grimness. And so you have to play up the magnitude of what's required. Like, what's required of us is heroicness. It's not small things. It's like absolutely life-changing stuff. So in my own work, I've chosen never to tell people what to do, even when they ask me, because I have come to believe that even though people think they want to know, you should, buy this and not that, or get involved with this movement, or fight for this or that, that actually they're looking for an exit door, because they'll evaluate the suggestion I gave and then say, they'll have 17 reasons why they don't want to do that. And then they'll use that to sort of exit. So I leave my readers in the uncomfortable place of never telling them what to do and simply showing them the changes I've made in my own life and how I've redirected. I've given away my money. I've gone to jail. The whole idea is that we have one life, and why not lead it heroically? And there are heroes around us, and that you can join together with these other heroes in this kind of David and Goliath fight. And why not be David? And then you have to do your own discernment to figure out where in this battle you want to join. Like, how do you want to be a hero? What are your tactics and strategies? What's your slingshot made out of that you're bringing to the Goliath of the chemical and fossil fuel industry? And that's something that you have to do through your own discernment. So I don't ever, I'm never scoldy. And I'm never try to operate by shaming people or making them feel guilty for not being involved. But I also never give them a place to enter. I never give them an on-ramp as a writer or a speaker. I just sort of show them what I'm doing and what other people are doing. And I feel like what the power of the kind of reportage that Kristina brings is that reporters understand how political power works. Scientists don't always get that. And so it's the case that our policies and our laws are deaf to the new science showing that this is harmful. So our whole regulatory system has become unresponsive to science. And so it's not going to move because I, as a biologist, keep bringing more data forward to the policy. It's just not. And so it's going to require this kind of heroic activism and policy work that people are already engaged in. And so the trick is to show people that and then make them feel through the power of your writing that they want to be part of that too, that makes your life really meaningful if you join this if you're also a hero.
Well, I think that is a lovely note to end on. I feel like we could keep this conversation going all day long, and it would be amazing to spend that time with you all. I have so much respect and admiration for the work that you all do and really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and wisdom and insights with us today. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today, today's participants, and for your thoughtful questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. We will pull those questions down and share them with our speakers. And if they have a chance, they might be able to respond. We can put that up on our website. But really appreciate your engagement, and also really appreciate our colleagues at the New School for co-hosting this with us. And with that, I'll hand it back to Kira for some final announcements.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kristina and Sandra. This was just such a superstar panel of women doing amazing things in the world. So thank you all for doing this important work. And as Kristin said, thank you all for joining us. You follow us on our SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube pages. Well, thank you all for joining us at the New School at Commonweal and at the CHE Café today. We'll see you next time, everyone.
Don't take it, 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 don't take it,